So this is our third and final research plenary for the conference. And with this, we're going to shift the focus squarely onto communities and neighborhoods and the role that they play in supporting pathways to the middle class. I mean, the themes that will be talked about today very much have connections both to discussions yesterday and to the remarks we just heard on the distribution of wealth and how that's shared across households. But we really want to understand how this looks at a community context and these very important network effects. So we're very pleased this morning to have Marjorie Austin Turner here to lead and moderate this panel discussion. Marjorie is a senior vice president at the Urban Institute, where in her current duties, she's focused on thinking about the strategy for policy-relevant research at Urban, and this makes her a perfect person to help lead us through this discussion, because as we've said in this conference, we want to make sure that we bring cutting-edge, important research to all of you, but we also want to make sure that we're putting that research in a way that's usable, actionable, answer the questions that we haven't yet answered in the research, and so I think Marjorie will do a great job of pushing all of our researchers to kind of explore the implications of their work. So with that, I will turn it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. The next segment of the conference this morning focuses on the relevance of where we live, why it matters, not just to our day-to-day quality of life, but to our prospects for economic mobility and our economic security. And while researchers spend a lot of time measuring and debating that point, I think every family fundamentally understands it, understands that the choices they make about where to live, where to invest in a home, where to send their kids to school, that these have really significant consequences for economic security and long-term life chances. So to kick off this morning's breakout conversations, we have three really terrific scholars sharing their recent research. And I think I'm going to suggest that they speak in this order. David Williams, who's Policy Director of Opportunity Insights at Harvard University, Mary Patillo, Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University, and Randall Akey, Associate Professor of Policy at the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. And they bring different perspectives and really interesting new evidence about the roles that neighborhoods play in supporting or constraining economic mobility and security. And I want to highlight as we start that all three of them address in important ways the intersections between place and race. And I think this is important to have front and center in the conversation, given our nation's history of housing discrimination, segregation, exclusion, and disinvestment. That's left us with profoundly and stubbornly separate and unequal communities. And those inequalities play out across domains, and I think they play out across the current evidence we're going to be hearing today. So with that, David, you want to start?
Is there a clicker I can use? Do you know?
I do not know.
Ooh.
Is there a clicker to advance?
Well, good morning, everyone. Okay, I know it's early. I need a little bit of energy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I appreciate that. My name is David Williams. I serve as the policy director at Opportunity Insights. Thank you very much. We are a research and policy lab founded by Professors Raj Chetty, John Friedman, and Nathan Hendren. And we use big data to think about economic mobility and what are the root causes of economic opportunity in our country. Before serving at Opportunity Insights, I was working in Detroit, Michigan, my hometown, as a senior advisor for Mayor Mike Duggan, working on issues of economic development, equity, real estate, and land use. And it's my role at Opportunity Insights to think about how we translate the research our research team does into actionable policy and partnerships with practitioners across the country. And it's my role to think critically about how we can be most supportive and responsive to the work that's actually happening on the ground to really influence and change policy so we can all be more impactful in the work we're doing every day. And I want to start by talking about the American dream, a multifaceted concept, but at its core, the idea that if we work hard, if we support our families, our children will be more successful, will be able to rise up the income ladder. But is that dream a reality? So our research team tried to distill that concept into one simple statistic by using historical tax record from the IRS, comparing earnings of children to their parents. And we see that in the 1940s, the American dream was a virtual guarantee. Over 90% of kids who were born in that decade grew up to earn more than their parents in adulthood. But we see that dream has faded significantly, so much so that by the 1980s, that dream has become a coin flip. Right? It's a 50-50 chance whether or not kids growing up in the 80s will be more successful, will earn more than their parents. And I think in many ways, this is at the core of a lot of the social and political frustrations we're seeing today, that the opportunity to rise up, to enter into the middle class, has become fleeting for many. And this in many ways animates our work, and I think my mission in general of how do we reverse these trends through policy at the local, regional, and national level. But despite these changes temporally, we also see the opportunity varies dramatically across the country. So this map here is looking at economic mobility rates across the country. And what we've done is basically following the outcomes of 20 million children who grew up between the late 1970s and the mid 1980s, and comparing their outcomes to the outcomes of their parents. So we see that across the country, this is looking at low-income children. You see in the Great Plains and the upper Midwest and on the coast, we have very high rates of economic mobility. So for kids who grew up in households making around $25,000, they're on average making upwards of $30,000, and even in a place like Dubuque, Iowa, making $46,000 on average, really high rates of mobility. But we see in the Southeast, in places like Charlotte, kids who grow up in low-income families, on average, are staying low-income adults. And so again, what might be causing this? What may be the policy levers that we need to think about to reverse these trends in these places where mobility is lagging? So one issue is job growth. Again, a place like Charlotte has been growing tremendously over the past 10, 20, and 30 years. But when we actually plot a metric like job growth with economic opportunity, we don't see much correlation. And we're actually working with a coalition of groups in Charlotte right now, and what I think they had the intuition and what we now see is that places like Charlotte, places like Atlanta, they've been growing, but they're also importing talent, right? They're magnets of opportunity for folks from across the country. But the low-income kids who grow up there aren't really benefiting from that prosperity in their own community. Another issue when we think about this map, if you know about demographics of this country, is thinking about race in areas that have a higher proportion of African Americans. And when we actually control for race, we see dramatic differences in outcomes. And one thing to note on this chart is that we're looking at the same color scale, and we're comparing outcomes for low-income black men compared to low-income white men. And so what this tells us is that the best places in terms of outcomes for black men are still worse than the worst places for white men. So we see a city like Newark, young black boys growing up in the same community with households making the same amount of money are growing up to make half as much as their white counterparts, again, in that same community from similarly situated families. And these outcomes are so dramatic, especially for black men compared to white men, that black men are more likely, who grew up in high-income families, are more likely to grow up to be low-income adults than to stay in that same income bracket. And so I mentioned I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and we see at the local level, the same range in outcomes we see nationally are represented in our own communities. They're areas of high and low opportunity. As you can probably imagine, a city like Detroit that's highly segregated, outcomes in the largely African-American city are much lower than their whiter suburbs. But one thing we've done here is actually control for black outcomes. So this chart is looking at black outcomes in neighborhoods in Detroit compared to average outcomes for similarly situated young black men throughout the country. And we start to see some nuance and some variation. And it also tells us about the real impacts of localized neighborhoods. So I pulled a couple examples of places in my hometown, the Northwest Goldberg neighborhood, where the average outcome for young black men who grew up, again, in families making around $25,000 is only $14,000. So we're seeing dramatic downward mobility in this neighborhood. Whereas just down the road, in a neighborhood called Aviation Subdivision, about 2 miles away, similarly situated young black men are making above average outcomes for black men, $29,000. Not great, but much better than their counterparts down the road. And let's think about what might be going on here. So what are other outcomes that might give us some intuition about what's happening? Look at incarceration rates. So that neighborhood, Goldberg, for those same black men who grew up there, an incarceration rate of 17%. And what that actually means for this metric is that of all the low-income young black men who grew up in that neighborhood, on the single day the census was taken in 2010, almost 1 in 5 of those young men was in jail or prison. And so I think some of these things start to help us think around what's happening in our neighborhoods, what is the impact of place, and might give us some intuitions around how we can start changing these trends. But I also want to reinforce that dramatic impact of place is that literally for every year of exposure to a neighborhood has impacts on children's long-term outcomes. And we ran an experiment nationally looking at families who made moves between neighborhoods. And we see that when families move to higher income neighborhoods, every year of exposure they're in that place has benefits for those children who grew up there. So much so that when families move, the younger siblings who move to that neighborhood, who have more exposure throughout their youth to that place, they on average have higher outcomes than their older siblings who had less exposure. Again, just reinforcing the importance of place, the importance of neighborhoods on our long-term outcomes. And so thinking about policy, we know that place matters, we see these impacts. How can we think about the policy levers that we can move to really increase economic mobility more broadly and really create more pathways into the middle class? So one is thinking about these patterns of segregation. Now that we can pinpoint neighborhoods that have a track record of benefiting the low-income families and children who grow up there, how do we start to bring down the barriers of access to those places for families of all incomes? So one thing we're working on right now is a pilot program with the Seattle and King County housing authorities in Washington, helping their families who have vouchers, who are interested in moving, helping again break down barriers of access to housing assistance support, landlord recruitment, and actually having brokers who support them through the housing search process to open up opportunities that they might not be aware of or didn't have access to before, those same neighborhoods that we know when kids grow up there, they have better outcomes in adulthood. But secondly, how do we invest in place, right? We're not going to solve the problem by just moving people around. How can we think more creatively about investing in neighborhoods that have been disinvested in to create better outcomes for everyone? And so we'll start by actually looking at what are the characteristics of high opportunity places. So I think things like lower poverty rates and better schools are pretty intuitive. Schools that have better outcomes for low-income kids, more integrated communities, these are healthier places for the kids who are growing up there. But there are also less intuitive factors as well. So one, like more stable family structure. We see in the data that neighborhoods that have a higher proportion of two-parent households, the kids in those places, they do better. And for example, we see very specifically, it's obviously very helpful for young black men to have a father figure in their household, but actually in neighborhoods that have more fathers present in general, all those young black boys, regardless of their own household circumstance, they do better on average in adulthood. And looking at social capital. So I mentioned earlier that job growth alone doesn't necessarily translate to economic mobility. Similarly, the proximity of jobs to a neighborhood does not seem to correspond highly with the outcomes for the kids who grow up there. But in neighborhoods where there are more employed people present, all those children do better. I think it helps us think more critically about the influence of exposure. Kids growing up, seeing people who they can relate to, who model pathways to college, to stable careers. And I think can help us think in a more nuanced way around what policy we're implementing within our neighborhoods to have real impact. And we're working with the community of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County to work with the community groups who are already on the ground, who know what's happening, who are doing great work, and helping them incorporate research and best practices to have real impact in their neighborhoods. And lastly, looking at higher education. How can we leverage our colleges and universities to be greater engines of economic mobility? And so using tax data, looking at two metrics here for schools in Boston where we're headquartered. For colleges across the country, what is the proportion of their student body coming from low-income households? And then for those kids, what are their success rates, right? What are the chances that those kids coming from low-income households make it into the upper income brackets? And so you have your places like Harvard that have extremely good results for their low-income kids. Probably you're not shocked by the fact that they don't actually have that many low-income kids. And then you see on the other end of the spectrum, some community colleges who have really good access, but the results for their students are a bit lower, which again is fairly intuitive. But we see that there are outliers as well. Right? There are schools that actually have pretty good access rates, and that are still able to propel those kids into the middle class and beyond. What lessons can we learn from those schools? How can we create better access at schools across the board? And how can we create local ecosystems in the higher ed space that are more supportive of all of our kids in general? So we have a partnership with about 400 colleges and universities to really learn those lessons, to dive into the data more deeply, get a more nuanced sense of exactly what is happening at these outperforming schools, and see what lessons we can learn. And our goal is to bring all of these things together. How do we help bring down barriers of access? How do we start to reduce our history of redlining and discrimination to create more access for everyone to high quality neighborhoods? How do we invest more efficiently to create opportunity across all of our neighborhoods? And how can we get kids to colleges that can help propel them into the middle class and beyond? And how do we, again, really start to reverse these trends we see in the American dream nationally? We can start at the grassroots, help build our communities up to the regional level, and again, thinking about how do we increase economic mobility, increase opportunity, and start to really rebuild the American dream. And our goal is to use our data resources to support folks who are working on the ground. So happy to continue that conversation and get folks ideas about how we can be a resource to the community, to practitioners here, and folks across the country. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Patillo, Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern, and I want to thank the conference organizers for the invitation and for this very stimulating conference. So in 1989, a Chicago neighborhood on the South Side, which is a predominantly black part of the city of Chicago, the neighborhood named Oakland, ranked 77th out of Chicago's 77 community areas in terms of the amount of mortgage dollars invested in the neighborhood. Total lending into Oakland amounted to a paltry $224,000. That compared to $33 million in nearby Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is located, and $258 million in the North Side, predominantly white neighborhood of Lincoln Park. By the year 2000, Oakland garnered over $3 million in mortgage financing. And by 2003, just 3 years later, total lending in Oakland amounted to over $24 million, more than 100 times the amount invested in the neighborhood in 1989. In other words, a housing market was born in Oakland over these years. In many ways, this represented important progress away from decades of redlining to instead being red hot. Given that so many places had been so disinvested as that this Oakland neighborhood had only had $224,000 in investment dollars, why would I title my talk today, Breaking the Market? So note that this is not a typo. I don't mean break as in B-R-E-A-K or ruin or cause not to function, but instead break as in B-R-A-K-E, as in slow down or put restraints on. So in the short time that I have today, is this the clicker? Is this the clicker? No. Do you have the clicker, David?
It's the clicker,
Is this it?
yeah. Yeah, the green.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, sorry. In my short time this morning, I want to talk about how market solutions alone are insufficient and perhaps even harmful for renewing the promise of the middle class in neighborhoods, cities, and metropolitan areas. And I want to emphasize the importance of breaking the market at the very earliest stages. So first, I'll give brief examples of how housing in neighborhoods are markets, and then talk about how the middle classes fare in some of those markets. I'll talk about markets and neighborhood change, show that there are always exclusions from markets and groups that cannot compete, and I'll sum up with some takeaway lessons for how to break the market. So first, daily news of trends in housing prices, foreclosures, mortgage interest rates, and, quote, new housing starts as an indicator of national economic health makes it quite clear that housing is a commodity. This has not always been the case, however, and it's important to recognize that the expansion of market logics ever further into the spheres of land and housing is an emergent feature of modern capitalism and isn't self-evident or given, and of course varies across the world. So many other countries have a much larger non-market housing segment than we have here in the US. In more recent history, housing has gone from being more than just a simple commodity to being a complex financial technology that showed the capacity to bring nearly the entire world economy to its knees in the Great Recession. In the wake of the 2008 housing crisis, several scholars have chronicled the causal force of mortgage securitization and have uncovered the role of various levels of government in developing and promulgating mortgage-backed securities in order to manage social crises, balance budget shortfalls, and generate revenues. After the New Deal and Great Society programs, the federal government's housing and neighborhood policies have increasingly been market-oriented. The most recent iteration is the New Markets Tax Credit Program, which is even more explicit about the fact that neighborhoods and housing are markets. Less visible in terms of thinking about neighborhoods and housing as markets is the EB-5 program that swaps visas to foreign nationals in exchange for investments in rural or distressed urban areas. The news arm City Lab recently reported the convoluted mapping techniques that allowed the high-end Hudson Yards development in New York, where only 400 of the 4,000 planned units will be designated as affordable, and how the developers of that project were able to connect slivers of ungentrified Harlem to this Hudson Yards development in order to qualify for EB-5 investments, again, where people who are wanting visas in the US invest in supposedly distressed neighborhoods, but instead those investments went to the Hudson Yards in New York. So obviously, markets will find a way, and when they find a way, they don't always do so in an inclusive manner. I guess this is inclusive in that it supposedly includes those parts of Harlem, but the Hudson Yards itself only includes 400 units of affordable housing. So next, let me talk a little bit about the middle classes and markets. So I am using the plural term, the middle classes, to gesture towards some of the things that Governor Brainerd mentioned earlier. There are significant racial differences in the income distributions and the subjective experiences of being middle class. Here we see how the income distribution for Blacks and Hispanics is skewed much lower than it is for whites, making for a smaller middle class for both groups and a more precarious and fragile one. This means that a figure like this one, which shows home price to income at various household income levels, doesn't even fully capture the challenges for many Black and Hispanic households. So if we look at the 50th percentile overall, which is the yellow line at the top, we see that throughout this period, from 1973 to the present, the ratio of median home price to income has always been above 2.5. It then went all the way up to above 4.5 in the Great Recession, and still remained above 4 in 2017. So this is the middle class that we're here to talk about today, but given that Black and Hispanic households disproportionately fall below this 50th percentile mark, we must really think about the many middle classes that the market affects. This means, so when we think about these middle classes, we need to think about them in our neighborhoods as they change. Housing and the neighborhoods they comprise are markets, and they go up and down in value. In Chicago, a current development of considerable discussion and debate is the building of Obama's presidential center, which is slated to be built in a park adjacent to low and moderate income Black neighborhoods, again on the South Side. The residents are fighting for a community benefits agreement to ensure that they benefit from jobs and to get housing protections so that they're not priced out of the neighborhood as it develops. Obama's response to these demands was the following, quote, "It's not my experience that the big problem on the South Side has been too much development, too much economic activity, too many people being displaced. We've got such a long way to go in terms of economic development before you're even going to see the prospect of significant gentrification. Malia's kids might have to worry about that." This comment is profoundly short-sighted, and it's at the crux of the problem of not breaking the market. The prices for detached homes in the adjacent neighborhood of Woodlawn rose 64%, and for attached homes rose 71%, just from 2016 to 2017 as the announcement for the presidential center was underway. Obama's remarks reminded me of a comment that a city planner made to the residents of the North Kenwood, Oakland neighborhood. I remember I started with Oakland, so this is a place where the market had been born. This is a neighborhood I studied in the early 2000s, and a city planner told the residents there, quote, "Land prices have shot through the roof in this area. In many ways, you are a victim of your own success." I already talked about what that looked like in Oakland, where the mortgage dollars increased 100-fold over the period from 1989 to 2003. In North Kenwood, it meant a more than quadrupling of housing prices from 1990 to 2016. It meant a more modest increase in rents, but from 1990 to 2016, but with fewer rental units available for people who were renting. So who can't compete? The victims of these neighborhood successes are not just low-income residents, but also moderate and middle-income residents. And that brings me back to the middle classes. These are the figures for the Chicago region and the population growth and decline by income group. So on your left, you see the white population with the dark blue line being below $50,000, the regular blue line being between $50,000 and $100,000, and the light green line being above $100,000. So basically in the Chicago region, in all groups, the high-income households are growing in the area, and the moderate and lower-income households for Blacks and whites are declining in the area. These are the groups who aren't able to compete. The map of the city of Chicago shows this even more starkly. This is Chicago in 1970, with the yellowish areas being middle-income areas, reddish areas being low-income areas, and blue areas being high-income areas. You see from 1970 to 2017, the movement towards a very stark tale of two cities, with a large low-income area of Chicago and a growing high-income area of Chicago as well. So we need to think about breaking the market even in those neighborhoods that are predominantly red on the map that I show here. Here we have figures. What I'm showing you here are figures for a black middle-class neighborhood that I've studied for the past 20 or so years. I give it the pseudonym Groveland in my research because the family shared very personal stories with me. But what we see in Groveland is a middle-class neighborhood that is declining. When we look at the neighborhoods in red in 2017, while overall their average per capita income qualifies as low income, these are neighborhoods where middle-income African Americans, and for the Hispanic neighborhoods, middle-income Hispanics live as well, given that multiple middle classes that I talked about earlier. So given the skewed income distribution for Black and Hispanic groups, the Black and Hispanic middle classes are lower income than the white middle classes and live alongside poor African Americans and Latinos. So when we think about reinvesting in the neighborhoods in red, in schools and jobs and housing, it's important to put brakes on these investments to protect affordability and to protect the ability of middle-class families to benefit from these investments. So what are those brakes? They include re-upping the contracts for project-based Section 8 housing and other hard unit subsidies, assembling land in currently low-income areas for public and nonprofit community land trusts to ensure long-term affordability, implementing property tax freezes and relief for low and moderate income homeowners, and possibly even for landlords if they pass those savings on to tenants and changing neighborhoods, giving priority housing choice vouchers for current residents, putting caps on rent increases, aggressive inclusionary zoning, so in the 20 to 30% range, and including deep affordability once new development is underway, and a reconsideration of public housing. If the market creates the kinds of inequalities and curtails the opportunities as we know it does, then we must increase, not decrease, non-market housing options. So let me conclude with 3 important takeaways for breaking the market. First, we must think about the middle classes. Again, the plural middle classes, which includes lower middle classes that are majority Black and Hispanic. Second, we need to think about counter-market public investments. When the private market is investing in neighborhoods A, B, and C, the public market, the public sector needs to be investing in neighborhoods X, Y, and Z. Right now, we have exactly the opposite, with the public sector improving the schools, the roads, the lights, and so on and so forth, in the places that the private market also considers hot. So I challenge all of us here today who are in the field of community development to ask yourself, what brakes do you have in place in the areas that you are currently implementing, in which you are currently implementing revitalization strategy? What brakes along the lines of the policies that I mentioned? Because if you don't have brakes on the market, you will be a victim of your own success. And you will have closed the doors of opportunity for the middle classes, especially the Black and Hispanic middle classes, rather than renewing the promise. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.
So, good morning, everybody. I'm Randy Akey. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I'd also like to acknowledge the land that we're on. Anytime you're in Washington, D.C., the land of the Pamunkey, the Anacostias, and the broader Delaware people. The research I'm going to show you ties a little bit to some of the findings that we have here about displacement, about place-based economic development and opportunity. And I'm going to be talking to you about a group that typically is not included in many of these discussions, primarily because of the lack of data. It's a small population, but it's a population that is quite unique for all kinds of reasons, one of which is that it overlaps both being a race group, but also a politically distinct class. American Indians, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiians, indigenous peoples in general, are a political class enshrined in our Constitution and in other people's constitutions in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, in many places. So they're distinct from just purely being a race or ethnic group. In addition, there are all kinds of really interesting opportunities that have gone on over time in these communities, and I'll show you some evidence for some encouraging ones that I and others have found, and I have done some work with actually people at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis at the Center for Indian Country Development, and I'll show you some of those results coming up. I'll show you some data that comes from the Census Bureau, and these are all my opinions, not necessarily those of the Census Bureau, so that's the disclaimer. So just to get started, again, most people don't have much of a knowledge of American Indian Alaska Natives. I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of some just basic characteristics similar to what was already presented. Middle class means different things in different communities and different populations, but just the population count, if you look at who considers themselves American Indian, there's about 500,000 residing on reservations we can estimate from about the 2016 American Community Survey. American Indians off reservations or in the U.S. as a whole is about 2.5 million. If we include that to include people who are American Indian and some other race, both of those numbers approximately double. And the U.S. population, just for comparison, is about 320 or so million people. What's more striking, I think, are the discrepancies in things like educational attainment. If you look at the third row there, college degree or more, for American Indians residing on reservations, only about 8% have a college degree or more. But that also permeates or persists in the U.S. as a whole, whereas on average for the U.S., it's about a 30%, and this is for adults 25 and older. Relating to just income levels, you see middle class means different things for different groups. There is a middle for American Indians, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiians. It's just much lower than it is for the rest of the average U.S. population. Right? It hovers in the mid $30,000, whereas it's in the 50s for the U.S. as a whole. Again, labor force participation rates differ, as do unemployment rates. Right? We saw in the opening the astonishing decrease in the unemployment rate for the U.S. on average, but again, there's stark differences within these groups. And for American Indians residing on reservations, it still hovers around 18%. Right? So these are numbers we don't typically think about or typically know about. So again, just to give you some snapshots of what's going on in these communities, this is some data that we put together using IRS data that's been linked with US Census data over time, and across the x-axis here you've got various years from 2000 to 2014, and what we look at is income inequality. We're looking at the log of earnings from the 90th percentile to the 50th percentile for these two groups. And I show you these two groups. We have a whole paper where we look at all race and ethnic groups. It's in demography if you're interested. But these two groups in particular, because these, as I mentioned earlier, are groups that you never see, because we never have data on a sustained level in a panel setting to look at them. And what you find is that even for this group, this, again, somewhat unique group of peoples, there's been an exacerbation or divergence in the earnings, in the incomes for those at the top. We see that there's been a dramatic increase, and these are in log terms, so it's almost a 15% increase between 2000 and 2014 in terms of the inequality that occurs between AIAN. So this is the top half of the income distribution. The bottom half of the income distribution, we see almost no difference. You see that big spike there in 2007. Again, as I mentioned, this is IRS data. A lot of people filed tax returns in 2007 for the tax rebates, if you remember. And so that increased the inequality there, but effectively it's primarily a level result across time. What this really goes to show us is that this community, much like the rest of the United States, not much difference going on in the bottom half of the income distribution, not much divergence or convergence, but all of the work, all of the change is happening at the top end, with the top end pulling away. This is another result, a transition matrix, looking at the exact same individual. So whereas much work has been done on, well, some work has been done on intergenerational mobility, this is really intragenerational. We're looking at the same person in the year 2000 and looking at that person again in the year 2014 by race. And this just happens to be AIAN, American Indian Alaska Native. If you look on the left there, we have the being in the bottom 20th percentile, that first row. And if you start out there, what's the likelihood of you being in that same category, the bottom 20%, by the year 2014? Remember, we're following the same exact individuals over time. And what that first number there, 56, tells you is that you have a 56% chance of remaining there. Right, so talking about being sort of the lack of opportunity, if you start out in the bottom, you're more than likely, more than half, to remain there. And to get to the top 20%, you only have a 2% likelihood, right, over time for AIAN. If you look at the very bottom, which is actually the top 20% of the income distribution, if you start out at the top, you have a 48% chance of remaining there. So again, this idea of polarization and sort of immobility is sort of shown here. We have the same results for Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and again, you get sort of the same results. And if anything, what's quite striking is that you're more likely, especially in the middle categories, and the middle categories would be the middle class, you have a slightly higher probability of backward sliding. So if you end up, in the 60 to 80 percentile or the 20 to 40 percentile, you're more likely to stay the same or go down than you are to go up. So all of these results are sort of pointing towards either immobility or downward mobility. So what might explain some of this and what might showcase what's going on? One of the things, this is work done with researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. We took the longitudinal business database and we geocoded establishments, whether they're located on reservation or off of reservations. This hadn't been done before. And the blue bars here tell us employment per capita. And it's a comparison between various establishments located on reservation versus off reservation, and a parity of one would mean there'd be equality. There'd be the same number of establishments, employment for the blue lines for the adjacent counties to the reservation counties. And what you see here is that there's much more than proportionate amount of employment in arts and recreation, which many of you may know probably relates to casinos and hotel operations, food and lodging, public administration, and this other category. What there's a deficit in is the black bars, which are the number of establishments per capita. So there's a lack of diversity on the types of business and the number of businesses across categories as compared to the adjacent counties, just right across the reservation border. So what this is telling us is that there's a lot of business employment going on, there's just not a lot of competition. And maybe some of this is driving some of the results we observe. Another result that we were able to look at is over the period of the Great Recession from 2007 to 2012. So the last picture I showed you was just a static picture in 2010. This is about business survival. This is about the establishment survival on reservation versus off reservation by various industries. And what you see is the red bars show the probability of business survival, and they're also all statistically significant, the red bars are, that there's a much higher likelihood of survivorship of firms in arts and entertainment, as well as education, healthcare, public administration, wholesale retail, located on the reservation as opposed to off the reservation. So there's some resiliency there that we don't understand yet. This is just a purely descriptive paper, but additional research that we're looking to conduct will sort of get at what is it that allowed for this resiliency in these establishments located on American Indian reservations as compared to their off-reservation counterparts, which is not something we typically think about when we think about American Indian reservations, as having these resilient businesses specifically over the Great Recession period. An additional area of research that I've worked on with others, looking at what impacts the longer-term success rate of of American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, are the impact of anti-poverty programs. And one program that stands out in particular are per capita cash transfers that are a result of the revenues from casino operations. Other people have been talking about this much broader. The term is universal basic income. In developing countries, they're called unconditional cash transfers. Here in the US, in American Indian communities, they're called per capita transfers, per capita payments. And we looked at a particular example in North Carolina, the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And what we found is sort of over this longitudinal data set that we have starting in the 1990s until today, we found that the children who were raised out of poverty, and again, remember for this group in particular, given the way the income distribution is skewed, there's a lot more individuals. The middle class is much more skewed in this population towards low income and the general guidelines of low income and poverty than other groups are. What we find is that once those children are raised out of poverty, we observe an increase in high school graduation rates by almost 40%, years of education at age 21 by almost over a year, arrests go down, the probability of voting, their civic engagement increases as adults, parental fighting has gone down, drug and alcohol abuse by parents decreases, and interestingly, we see no difference in parental labor force participation. This is sort of one of the big critiques about universal basic income, is that it will dissuade people from working or sort of create this decrease in labor force participation. At least for this community, with the size of the transfers that they receive, it doesn't seem to affect the parents' labor force participation, broadly speaking. Other people have done work on this as well, looking at a broader measure of treatment, specifically whether or not an American Indian casino operates in the county in which you live, and they find some interesting health outcomes, reduction in smoking, reduction in heavy drinking. So again, we talked a little bit about sort of this investment in place, investment in rural communities, investment in underdeveloped communities. This is one of those examples, I think, that is sort of poorly understood and poorly researched, or scant research conducted on it, but there are some real advantages and there are some real benefits that have resulted here. And there's still some mysteries, as I said. We still don't understand why this resiliency for on-reservation establishments as compared to the right off the reservation adjacent counterparts. It's still a puzzle to us. So I think, again, these discussions of what propels communities that have low levels of earnings, low levels and high levels of unemployment up into sort of higher parts of the income distribution or higher levels of employment. This is an area that's ripe for doing additional work, just for the communities themselves. There's a lot to be done in these communities, but also I think there are lessons to be learned that can be shared more broadly with other communities in the US as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you all. I thought we might open up the conversation a little bit to focus more on what all this evidence means for solution strategies. And David introduced the broad idea in the context of these place disparities of investing in both residential mobility and reinvestment strategies. And I want to give both Randall and Mary a chance to kind of respond to that broad two-pronged way of thinking. What does it mean for the issues of middle classes that are African American and Hispanic people, but also what applicability does it have for people living on and off reservations from Native communities?
So first of all, I just want to say thank you for the balanced approach. Marge and I well know, and I'm sure many of you in the audience know, that unfortunately we sometimes get at each other, the mobility and the place-based folks. So kudos for not even putting that on the table, but there I go, putting it on the table. In those debates, I am on the place-based side. That does not mean that I don't support mobility endeavors. It is more that the reason I'm on the place-based side is an emphasis on the strengths and resiliencies and contributions of both predominantly black neighborhoods, predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods, and also predominantly low-income neighborhoods. So as an African American studies scholar especially, I want to, there are many things about predominantly black neighborhoods that I think should be conserved and saved and invested in, and black neighborhoods make contributions to cities, to politics. Despite my critique of Obama, of course, Chicago has produced the first black president, the first black woman senator, so on and so forth, in Carol Moseley Braun a number of years ago. So I think having those kinds of place-based investments are important for the people who make the decision because of generations of living in a community, because of social network ties, because of convenience and access to jobs and public transportation and so on and so forth, to be able to stay in place and have the opportunities of a healthy neighborhood right there in their own neighborhood.
But I want to push back a little bit because I think your terrific presentation sort of raised the specter that when we do the reinvestment, when we reverse the bad decisions of the past of disinvesting in those communities and reinvest in them, we're letting the market run away from us. And potentially that reinvestment, long awaited, doesn't benefit the people who suffered from the disinvestment of the past, or their kids, or their communities. I really liked that your presentation ended with a list of very concrete things to do about it, and I'm not going to recite them. The trick is starting them early enough. And I wonder what you are thinking about. What are the early warning indicators that come early enough that we can actually get those market breaking mechanisms in place in time?
Indeed, I actually think the figure that I showed is the early warning mechanism, meaning the figure that I'm talking about are the two maps next to each other that basically show Chicago as blue and red and nothing much else. The early warning signs are when prices and disinvestment has gotten so severe that investors are likely to see that despite some risks, the profits to be made are real. And that's because of the rent gap, because of that disparity in prices. So I think it's a map like that that tells us that's the early warning sign. And at a moment when land prices are affordable is when nonprofits should be assisted in perhaps putting together community land trusts. The city of Chicago should start, it will assemble land for other things, the Obama Presidential Center included. So this is a moment to assemble land for community land trusts as well. That's just one of the mechanisms that I mentioned. But thinking about the affordable housing, project-based and so on, that's there now, and their contracts and how they might expire. So I think that is the early warning sign.
Yeah, the absence of the market, is the sign we need to get in there ahead.
Exactly, yeah. Right.
Terrific. Randall?
So I think I want to just reinforce some of the things you just said as well. I mean, again, American Indians, Alaska Native, indigenous peoples are sort of the original sort of, displaced communities, right, in this country, in many countries around the world. And I think, that was the clear issue is that once there was the acknowledgement of sort of the inherent sovereignty and the political governance of these groups to control their own economic, social, political destinies, that was sort of the era that began increased economic development. And I think that's what you're talking about as well. This idea that when decisions are made on the kind of economic development, the way the choices are going to be made are done at the local level. I think those are the most successful American Indian economic development success stories that we have. And again, that's what I mean. I think some of these successes need to be broadcast a little bit more, amplified, because other communities that are in slightly different scenarios, but also sort of lack or suffer from the ability to self-govern or the ability to have a voice in the governing structure as well as the economic structure. There are myriad examples in American Indian, Alaska Native communities where that has gone on historically and where some have overcome it. And I think that's where we really overlap there.
So that's interesting. It links the idea of political or governance control over the reinvestment with building in co-ownership, community ownership, economic control from the beginning. David, I want to come back to you. You've identified 4 attributes in neighborhoods that are associated with high mobility for kids growing up in those neighborhoods. So 4 attributes that I would think we would like to see rebuilt or reinforced. And they are lower poverty, more stable family structure, greater social capital, better school quality. And so what I want to challenge you on a bit is, so what are the levers for community-based organizations, government, that move those attributes in the right direction? And maybe I would be particularly challenging on what are our policy levers on family structure, social capital? How do we get more of them?
Absolutely. So you're starting with the hard questions, I see. Yeah. I think part of what we do is we bring the data to the fore to help start that conversation. And when I put my policy maker hat back on from Detroit, I think the issue of family stability, I think, can be controversial from different sides of the political spectrum, right? I think maybe on one side it's, we need to really encourage marriage, right? That's what's going on. The other side could be looking at issues in the criminal justice system and why aren't there enough black fathers in some of these neighborhoods. And so when I'm thinking about a place like Detroit, kind of combining these issues of, community helping lead the conversation, how do you kind of plan for gentrification, but also how do you think critically about gentrification, right? So I think one thing we try and do as well is that, there are stereotypes around low-income neighborhoods are all bad or white neighborhoods are all good, but actually looking at what are the outcomes for the kids who grow up there. So looking, almost a certain sense objectively at, are these places good in terms of what they do to the kids who live there? And so, for example, one example when I'm thinking about a place like Detroit is we weren't focused on economic development, economic growth, because people have been leaving the city for decades. And I think one strategy is how do we actually rebuild the middle class? How do we bring folks back in, potentially middle class black families who don't just bring wealth back into the community, but I think actually can provide that role model piece, that exposure piece that could, I think through the data, might help us think, might help those kids who are in low-income families who then can relate to those folks who look like them rather than just bringing in what we typically assume gentrification is like, white yuppies or empty nesters who, might bring resources to the community, but might not integrate in the same way that a middle-class black family could. So that's just one example of kind of using the data to think more critically about what place-based development might look like in ways that might drive outcomes, given what the data is showing us.
Yeah. So bringing the evidence to the community decision-making process and really opening the door for their insights on how to get there. So I was really interested that Randall put essentially UBI on the table in a conversation about place. But I think it connects in a really important way to Mary's evidence on the skewed income distributions. And I wanted to give David and Mary a chance to sort of reflect on this. Should we be pulling the UBI policy lever into our thinking about place and the role that neighborhoods play in people's lives?
Well, I think it was especially interesting for me seeing those numbers and then thinking about it in terms of intergenerational mobility. And I think kind of similar with the research that we've done around the differences between place. Oftentimes, if someone who's already grown up, if they're moving to, let's say, a better, higher opportunity neighborhood, we're not seeing as dramatic impacts as we do for the kids who grow up there. And I think similarly, almost kind of disentangling the conversation of the impact on that adult who receives that support, but how by creating potentially a more stable family structure, by creating more stability for those children, seeing the long-term outcomes of the benefit of a policy, I think just helps reframe the conversation in a positive and more critical way. I think kind of helps us think about some of these policies, it might not just be about that person directly receiving that benefit, but in the long run, really pushing longer term benefits. I think is a really interesting and impactful way of framing that. And I think just kind of almost a little light bulb in me as well, seeing some of those data as well.
Yeah, the evidence on the effects for children of UBI are very similar to the evidence on the MTO.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mary?
So what struck me is this is another area where we sometimes act as if there's a debate, but there shouldn't be, which is people investments versus place investments. And place investments might be improving schools or improving roads or lighting or better police relationships and so on. And people investments are getting skills up, improving income and so on. Obviously, these are not separate things. And if we just think about housing affordability, on the one hand, we could have housing policies that low-income housing tax credit or what have you, but if we also, to lower the price of housing, but we could also increase the income of people, and that would get us back to affordability as well. So a UBI is a way to work on the income side as opposed to on the housing price side. So I surely think in the same way that labor market policies are important. I think the other kind of synergy there is that UBI is perhaps an income way of thinking outside the market, which is my point about breaking the market as well. Thinking about non-market housing options, this is a way to think about non-market income options, because it's not about labor market, but rather about a guaranteed basic income.
And I'll just add one thing to this as well. We're working on some additional analysis now. We're actually finding that it's bringing American Indians back to the reservation because there are actually economic opportunities there now that didn't used to exist. So where you had these out-migration sort of to neighboring cities, to Phoenix, to LA, to Chicago, you're seeing people come back over time, and they're coming back with slightly higher human capital as well. So it creating the opportunities creates the incentives for people to come back and reinvest as well. So again, we're not done with that research yet, but it's exciting to see some of these insights that might be a possibility.
So I think we should open up this conversation to the whole audience, but I wanted to get one other set of ideas sort of in circulation first while people think about what they want to ask or say. Governor Brainerd mentioned exclusionary zoning and zoning tools. And I think the conversation that we've had thus far about housing and neighborhoods focused, I think, a little too narrowly on reinvestment in distressed neighborhoods and on using tools like housing vouchers to enable people to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. And I think we all agree we want to do both. But I think we also need to be expanding the conversation to getting regional housing markets working more effectively and more fairly. That if we just revitalize some neighborhoods and give people some housing vouchers, while most opportunity-rich neighborhoods essentially continue to exclude people with low incomes and using their zoning powers, that's what fuels the runaway markets in those neighborhoods. So maybe this is putting more both ends than any brain can manage on the table at once. But.
Well, in fact, I had included more slides in my presentation than the 15 minutes would allow, and what I was going to include, and it wasn't my research, so I thought, okay, this part I could take out. Ed Getz has some forthcoming research on racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence. So instead of the racial and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, he is looking at the opposite side.
The opportunity hoarding.
The opportunity hoarding part of the scenario. So I was going to make some comments on that. So mostly I'll just say yes, 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 definitely. And he finds, and there's another paper on, I think, Kentucky that finds that those areas have actually grown. We often look at concentrated poverty as growing, but those areas of concentrated, racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence have also grown, and that's definitely something that we need to think about, opening up those areas.
And I think on that front, I mean, I think I'm of the camp that these two things can work in concert, place-based versus the mobility piece, but I think they actually have to work in concert. Because I really doubt that if we're a country and if we're communities that are okay with neighborhoods becoming more isolated and poor and more isolated and rich, I doubt we're gonna also invest in the ways and break the markets like you're talking about. Right? Like, I really feel like those two things aren't going to be able to coexist, so it really has to be breaking down barriers of access across our regional communities and then thinking critically about both investing and protecting those markets as well. So again, it's a both and, but maybe a stronger version of the both and.
Right. It's not just a, okay, let's both go down this path together. It's we're going to fail separately if we don't go down this path together. So does that create an opportunity for more people to jump in the conversation?
Are you ready? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My name is Mel Jones. I'm the Associate Director of the Virginia Center for Housing Research at Virginia Tech. About 2 years ago now, we conducted a very large study looking at the connections between economic development and housing. We found that it is invaluable to provide housing all along the income spectrum in order to compete in the sort of nationwide and global market for talent. So it's the crux of really supporting the market in the long term. We talk about using these braking tools, but they're really acceleration tools, we believe, in the very long term. So Mary, I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of communities that have done a really stellar job of using these tools to promote traditional economic development, Main Street style development, and long-term well-being to really provide people the choice of where they want to live, whether they want to stay in place or move or do whatever they want to do. Also, I want to emphasize that your conversation earlier about what are the early warning signs? I want to argue that it doesn't matter. We have to have these tools in place now, no matter what our circumstances are. They take a long time to develop. It's politically hard to develop these tools. And so if you haven't started, now, no matter what your situation is. So I'm wondering if you have some really good examples.
Thank you for that excellent point. I totally agree. That's much better said, actually. As you mentioned, it's hard to come up with good examples because these tools are very hard, and often one of the things that they hit up against is that city planners, elected officials, and so on want to attract higher income folks to neighborhoods within the city because higher income folks consume more, pay more in taxes, give more in political contributions, all manner of things, cost less in terms of services. And so the advocacy organizations are often kind of butting up against political planners and politicians who want to increase, who want those blue areas to grow. So the example that I often give, but I don't think that there is an example that no one can critique, so any of my Boston folks here, I'm sure you will have critiques, but the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative is one that begins with people power. And that's, I think, where one has to begin, and has cultivated local leadership, intergenerational local leadership, has worked across racial and ethnic divisions and divides, linguistic differences as well, in a super hot market city of Boston. And their signature project is a community land trust. And they continue to work on all manner of issues from environmental justice to job development. So the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, I think, would be my example of especially the breaking the market through the community land trust. And if anybody else has examples, I would love to hear them, because I love to continue to read up on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll second that. I actually visited them a couple weeks ago to try and learn some of the lessons, what they're doing, and it really is about that people power piece.
Yep.
I mean, I think maybe just one perspective is the difficulty of this work as well. So I think just again, my Detroit perspective, a city where we were doing exactly that, right? We are trying to attract new residents to the city because our population has lost over almost 1 million people over the past 50 years. There's not a tax base to provide competent city services, so it really is about rebuilding. And I think one thing that I try and use the data to help have more nuanced conversations about these things, because something that we see and I dealt with in economic development was when we're bringing new development, when we're bringing new folks into the community in ways that I think we need to do, there is a healthy amount of mistrust that is well placed by current residents. Right? I think we're never going to have a healthy community without some mix of incomes and actually a tax base that can contribute to the city. But folks who have been in the city for a long time say, hey, there are new people coming in. My life may actually be a bit better because the streetlights are working, we have better city services, but I'm not benefiting in a way that seems comparable to all these new residents, right? And so I think sometimes it's actually hard to have a productive conversation when there is that mistrust. And so really, again, having the conversations, having the meetings, and hopefully using data to have a nuanced conversation to be able to work through those very difficult issues, both perception and reality of what's happening.
But the mistrust can be countered by amplifying the breaks early on, by letting the community know what breaks you're simultaneously working on while you're working on the things to attract the higher income folks.
I've often thought that sometimes we also take too short, we look at these neighborhood and community change initiatives with too short a window. And I think that can go two ways. We can see that investments we made are really paying off, and we don't stick around long enough to see, well, they actually end up getting out of control and causing displacement. So sometimes our short window causes us to miss some unintended negative consequences. But also I think sometimes that near-term distrust, getting to know each other, inability to communicate can be overcome by community building in the long term. And a generation later, we have a neighborhood that is serving all its children well. Might have had a rough process of getting there. So I wonder, I don't know if you've seen any of that more positive version of the...
The neighborhood I live in Chicago that I studied for my book, Black on the Block, it's called North Kenwood, Oakland, as I just mentioned, and it had rocky beginnings because it was not clear that there were breaks on the market, but there were two external breaks. One is the housing crash of 2007, 2008. So in a place that had gotten quite hot, the housing crash meant that development plans that were in process stalled, and the public housing that was not going to be replaced got replaced because that was kind of the only place there was money to continue to build. So it's an interesting now mixed income, predominantly African American still, so it's not like parts of Harlem that have changed class and racially. I think it kind of is in that moment, but I think there's still always the importance of thinking about those breaks. A lot of the Section 8 contracts have expired, and so I think if the market heats back up, Chicago is not as hot as Boston, New York, LA, Oakland, so on. So that's something to think about.
Hi, good morning. I'm Anika Goss-Foster. I'm the Executive Director of Detroit Future City. We're a think and do tank in Detroit that focuses on land use and economic development. And we just recently released a report as well on Detroit's African American middle class as an opportunity for prosperity for Detroit. And a couple of the challenges, so I really appreciate, let me just say, I really appreciate all of you up there. Hi, David, from Detroit. But a couple of the key things that we are finding after the report was released from the data is that, one, this idea of a near middle class, so just under the middle class that's working, that's doing well, but are still living in really disinvested neighborhoods, being able to secure those families, which end up being for Detroit, the majority of Detroiters, that securing those communities includes both a place-based investment initiative as well as this economic security initiative. And so the combination of the two for that particular group is really critical. And I'm just wondering how much of your research, because we're also finding that with that group, there are very serious inequities, so that it's so much easier to make more money in the near-ring suburbs, and your money goes further because you don't have all of the urban costs that you might by staying in Detroit. So as soon as your job gets a little better, as soon as you just make a little more money, it's easier for you to move. And so then what we're finding is that African American middle class families are moving at a much higher rate, and then white middle class families are returning to the neighborhoods that are stabilizing in Detroit. So if any of your research has also then focused on this sort of combination of not just the UBI, which really benefits the lower income families, but that lower middle class, that near middle class base that is really vulnerable in losing in terms of an economic development strategy.
Yeah, I mean, these are issues that, so I've been gone for 9 months now from Detroit, so good to see you. But I think that's where the complications are, right? I think there's so many different issues happening, and they're layered in different ways. And I think, one issue that oftentimes get overlooked as well is that just issues of eviction and churn that have nothing to do with rising rents, just poverty, right? So, I mean, there are lots of families who are losing homes and moving, not because their neighborhoods are getting better, but because their neighborhoods have been, getting worse for 10, 20, 30 years. So, how do you provide the human capital supports, the financial supports to help them stay in place? And then similarly, how do you invest in ways that incentivize those working and middle class families to stay while putting in those breaks in place and actually planning for success? So it's really that interesting and difficult balance of, I think, improving places in ways that our communities deserve. I think actually planning for success in a real way to put those policies in place so that once we do have success and rents rise, we're prepared for that. But doing all those things at the same time in a thoughtful way is very difficult. And I think without grounding that in the actual data to make difficult decisions about resources is very, very hard. So I think you have to do the community work, you have to do the data work, and you have to kind of think critically about all these issues at the same time. And I think whatever resources we can bring to the table to support policymakers as they're making these hard choices, I think is always of benefit.
Randall?
So I'll just talk a little bit really briefly about the UBI situation. The research situation that I looked at, actually everybody in the community got it. So not just low-income people, every tribal citizen got it. So there were relatively rich people who got it in the community. So it was a really, really nice natural experiment. And one of the things we looked at, one of the mechanisms that we were very interested, because there's a lot of research, there's this moving to opportunity research that a lot of people have looked at. We were really interested in this story that, okay, well, all of the results we're seeing that for the children, is it based on the fact that these families are taking the money and they're picking up and they're moving to a community that has better amenities, a community off the reservation, a community adjacent to the reservation. And we have some evidence, and much of it appears that they're sort of investing in their community. Much of it looks like they're not moving. So especially one of the results that we have is the civic engagement. Do you vote as an adult for the children and for the parents? And we only find a significant change for the children who are treated. And what it really looks like is that they're not moving. They're not moving county, they're not moving state. We have information on that. Some people do move. But the biggest effects for this engagement, this continued voting as adults, happens from those who receive the UBI but don't leave. It allows them somehow, some way to stay in their community. So we have some suggestive evidence of that.
And I would just add that I mentioned briefly community benefits agreements. So it's, again, the Obama Center will bring jobs, both short-term in construction and long-term with the center once it's up and running, but has very much resisted a community benefits agreement. But this is a people investment strategy. If people in the neighborhood are given preference for jobs, they will then have the incomes to be able to afford the housing. And we can think about community benefits agreements for all kinds of new developments. So as Detroit is building, especially downtown, what are the restrictions for the folks who work in those construction jobs, who get the jobs in the new hotels and so on and so forth. I mean, if we, at the public sector level, we have required, some cities require that teachers and firefighters and police officers and so on live within the city, and that helps to shore up whole neighborhoods of police officers, firefighters, teachers, and so on. And thinking about the same thing, if you're going to be a construction worker on this new hotel that's getting massive state or city subsidies, then you need to live within the city of Detroit. People will find a way to live within the city of Detroit. So those, I think, are some ways to think about that kind of investment and growth.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, but why don't we do a close-up in the front on this side and then on this side? And then I think we'll wrap up.
My question is short. My name's Margaret Van Vliet. I'm in Sonoma County, California. I'm the housing director for the County of Sonoma. And we are working to recover from the 2017 wildfires that destroyed about 5,300 homes in our community. And I want to thank you for your work. You've given me a ton to think about in the context of what we're doing in Sonoma County. But I wonder to what degree any of you have sort of seen this kind of work with an overlay of disaster recovery, because we sort of know generally that communities of color and disadvantaged communities fare worse when there are large influxes of federal disaster resources. So I just wondered if you had any sort of quick references of studies or issues that you know of where these two things intersect. Thank you.
A quick reference, James Elliott and others about post-Houston, Hurricane Houston, yeah, you got that. And FEMA money for mortgages in Houston, basically going to disproportionately to higher income and to whiter neighborhoods in Houston. So James Elliott is the lead author on that.
Yeah, I think sadly what we have is experience of inequitable rebuilding. One of the things that the Urban Institute has been doing in recent months is sort of looking out ahead and asking some big questions about what it would take to get some of these mobility and equity questions right. And there's a very nice piece written by Carlos Martin on equitable climate adaptation. So it is not just about recovering after these climate-related disasters, but how do we start adapting for the inevitable community changes of climate change in ways that don't disadvantage the most affected populations, which are typically communities of color and lower income communities. Okay.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I'm in supervision and regulation at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. I wanted to get the panel's opinion on cash subsidies that have no strings attached. I asked this question because in Stockton, California, they have come up with a program. It's a public-private partnership that would give $500 a month to selected families over an 18-month basis, with the idea that these families might use this money for personal hygiene, paying rent, childcare. Obviously, this is more geared towards those that have been identified as living in poverty, but maybe you can offer your perspective on how this could maybe enhance and benefit, its potential to enhance or benefit communities.
Thank you. So I've just gotten the stop signal, but can I give Randall the opportunity or
that's you, Randall. That's your
one
question.
sentence? I think that really sounds like a version of universal.
I mean, I think the benefit would be that it allows people to stay in place, continue their networks, their communities, and I think that's the upside of it.
Yeah. And so I think just a quick point, not as closely tied to UBI, but I think just overall when we're thinking about place-based work, I think community benefits agreements, these different braking mechanisms, I think a lot of cities work very hard at these issues. I think it's also important to look at the other constraints at the regional and state level that they have to work within. So when competing for residents between city and suburbs, oftentimes there's that balance of providing the supports for our residents, putting brakes on development, but also being competitive and attracting that development as well. So I think oftentimes, definitely push for your local folks at the city and county level to have really progressive policies, but also think about and advocate for change on larger levels that gives them more leeway to do this good work as
Right,
well.
absolutely, given that these are regional housing markets,
Exactly.
regional labor markets. The jurisdictions can't limit their, control their destinies, really.
Exactly.
So thank you very much. I'd like to thank this terrific panel. I learned a ton today.